I'm in the middle of the audiobook of the Book of Enoch, and it's one of the wildest things I've ever listened to in my life.
Someone asked Grok AI a direct question about the Book of Enoch and what it says about the year 2026. The answer came back in detailed, specific language that researchers who study ancient apocalyptic texts have been sitting with ever since.
AI chatbot Grok, created by Elon Musk's XAI, has been responding to queries with unrelated information.
The Book of Enoch was written over 2,000 years ago. It was quoted in the New Testament. It was preserved by the Ethiopian church when almost every other tradition set it aside.
The Ethiopian Bible is the oldest Bible. The oldest copy of the Ethiopian Bible is 14th century.
What it apparently says about this specific moment in history is the part nobody expected. The text that was kept aside. The Book of Enoch is one of the oldest surviving pieces of Jewish religious writing. It is attributed to Enoch, described in the Book of Genesis as the seventh descendant from Adam and one of only two figures in the Hebrew Bible who did not die in the conventional sense. Genesis says simply that Enoch walked with God and then was not, because God took him. That brief and extraordinary departure made Enoch a figure of enormous significance in ancient Jewish thought and inspired centuries of writing in his name. First, Enoch, the most complete and most studied of the texts associated with this figure, is not a short document. It is a full-length work organized into 5 distinct sections, each addressing a different aspect of a sweeping vision of cosmic history and the end of the current world order. It covers the fall of heavenly beings called the Watchers, the fate of their offspring, the Nephilim, the secrets of the heavens and their calendar, a visionary history of all human civilization, and a final accounting of the righteous and the wicked. The text was quoted directly in the New Testament letter of Jude, which reproduces a passage from Enoch word for word as a scriptural authority, suggesting that at least some of the early Christian community treated it with the same weight they gave other authoritative texts. Jesus and his disciples lived in a world where the Book of Enoch was widely known and widely read among Jewish communities. The discovery of multiple copies among the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed that it was one of the most circulated texts among the Essenes, the Jewish community that preserved those scrolls. It was eventually excluded from most canons, not condemned, not declared heretical, set aside for reasons that had more to do with institutional complexity and doctrinal tidiness than with any judgment that the text was false. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never set it aside. They kept it as scripture, read it weekly, and treated it with the same authority given to the books that the rest of the world calls the Old Testament. When Grok was asked what this text says about 2026, the response drew on the full body of the text, its specific numbered prophecies, its astronomical sections, and its visions of history organized into structured time periods, and pointed at a convergence that the researchers in the room did not have an immediate answer for. What Grok said first. Grok's opening response to the question was specific in a way that distinguished it immediately from general commentary about the Book of Enoch's relevance to modern times. It did not offer vague parallels between ancient language and contemporary events. It identified specific structural features of the text, specific prophecies with specific parameters, and traced their implications forward through the historical timeline to the present. The characterization Grok offered was this: the Book of Enoch functions as a detailed blueprint for a specific period of human history, and the parameters of that blueprint, when traced carefully through the text and mapped against historical chronology, converge with precision on the generation currently alive in 2026. The text describes Enoch as a figure who was taken into the heavenly realm and shown things that were not meant for his own generation but for a remote one, a far future time when the conditions he witnessed would actually occur. First, Enoch makes this explicit in its opening chapter, which states that the vision was not for this generation, but for a distant generation that would come. This framing positions the entire text as a document written for a specific future audience, not for general religious instruction. The question Grok's analysis addresses is whether the generation described in the text, the one for whom the visions were meant, corresponds to the generation now alive. The specific prophecies Grok identified as relevant to this question fall into 4 categories: the 70 generations countdown, the return of the Watcher's influence, the astronomical calendar alignment, and the apocalypse of weeks framework. Each of these represents a distinct structural element of the text with its own internal logic and its own implications for the question of when the described events were meant to occur. The 70 generations countdown. The most specific and widely debated chronological element in 1st Enoch appears in chapter 10, where the fallen angels, often identified as the Watchers, are said to be bound for 70 generations, until the time of their final judgment. Unlike the symbolic or poetic language found throughout much of apocalyptic literature, this passage stands out because it presents a concrete numerical framework. It does not simply suggest a distant future or an undefined span of time. It specifies a measurable interval, 70 generations. After the completion of this period, the binding of these beings ends, and a decisive act of judgment is initiated. Some modern analytical approaches, including computational interpretations such as those attributed to Grok's examination, have attempted to map this generational timeline onto historical and biblical genealogies. These analyses proceed by tracing lineage counts forward from the time traditionally associated with Enoch, using generation lengths that are either explicitly stated in Scripture or inferred from broader textual patterns. Because ancient genealogies do not define a fixed number of years per generation, such reconstructions necessarily involve assumptions, and different methodological choices can produce varying results. Even with these uncertainties acknowledged, certain models place the completion of the 70-generation period in the general vicinity of the present era. In other words, depending on how one defines a generation, the projected endpoint of this symbolic chronology can be interpreted as aligning with the current or very recent generation. This does not function as a precise prediction in the modern scientific sense, but rather as a structured interpretive framework that some readers find striking when aligned with long-range historical timelines. Within the text itself, the significance of the 70-generation limit is tied to what occurs at its conclusion. The Watchers, whose actions introduced corruption and disorder into the world, remain restrained until the appointed time. When that restraint ends, the narrative describes a transition into judgment, where the consequences of their influence are fully addressed. This moment represents not only a reckoning for the supernatural beings involved, but also a broader shift in the moral and cosmic order described throughout the book. Importantly, the passage does not necessarily imply a single instantaneous event. Instead, it can be read as describing a transitional period, an epochal turning point in which the structure of reality moves from one condition to another. The end of the 70 generations may therefore be understood as a threshold experienced by those living through it, rather than a narrowly defined moment in time. In this interpretive context, some modern commentators have suggested that the current generation could be situated within this transition, though such claims remain speculative and dependent on interpretive choices rather than universally accepted chronology. The Watchers and what they taught. First Enoch's account of the Watchers is its most famous and most discussed section, and it is the section whose modern relevance Grok's analysis found most concrete. The Watchers, in the text's account, were 200 heavenly beings who descended to Earth and broke the boundary between their nature and human nature. The location given for their descent is Mount Hermon. They swore an oath to each other before they came down, understanding that what they were about to do was a violation, and bound themselves together in the commitment before doing it anyway. What the Watchers taught to the human beings they encountered is cataloged in specific detail in the text: weapon-making, the practice of sorcery, astrology, and the reading of signs for purposes of manipulation, the alteration of natural processes in ways that produced results nature alone would not produce, the creation of cosmetics and ornamentation used in ways the text describes as connected to spiritual corruption and sexual manipulation. From the unions between the Watchers and human women came the Nephilim, a generation of beings described as enormous, violent, and consuming, who devoured the earth's resources and turned on humanity. The Nephilim were killed in the flood. The text says their bodies died, but their spirits did not. The disembodied spirits of the Nephilim became, in the Book of Enoch's cosmology, the evil spirits that continue to afflict and corrupt human beings throughout history. And the Watchers themselves were bound, imprisoned in darkness, awaiting the judgment that the 70-generation countdown was measuring toward. Grok's analysis of the modern relevance of this framework was careful to note that it is working with an ancient text that uses the conceptual vocabulary of its own time. It does not claim that the entities described in 1st Enoch are literally present in the form the text describes. What it does identify is a set of categories of corrupting influence that the text associates with the Watcher's activity, and a parallel set of developments in the present world that occupy the same functional roles. The teaching of forbidden knowledge that gives human beings destructive capabilities before they have the wisdom to manage them. The alteration of biological nature to produce outcomes that would not occur naturally. The development of systems of manipulation that exploit human weakness at scale. The concentration of powerful capabilities in the hands of small groups who use them in ways that serve their own interests rather than the common good. Artificial intelligence developed and deployed faster than the ethical frameworks for managing it exist. Genetic editing technologies that alter human biology at the foundational level. Information systems designed and used to manipulate belief and behavior at population scale. These are the functional modern equivalents of what the text describes the Watcher's teaching, and they have all emerged with extraordinary speed in exactly the period that the 70-generation countdown points to as the time of the Watcher's full accountability. The Calendar and the Cosmic Order. One of the 5 books within 1st Enoch is known as the Astronomical Book, covering chapters 72 through 82. It is often the least read section for general audiences because it shifts away from narrative and prophetic drama into a highly structured, technical description of celestial mechanics. Instead of focusing on angels, visions, or moral exhortation, it presents a detailed account of how the sun, moon, stars, and seasons are said to operate according to a fixed and divinely established order. The tone is systematic, almost instructional, as if it were outlining a cosmic calendar rather than telling a story. At the center of this section is a 364-day solar calendar. The year is divided into 4 equal seasons of 91 days each, with each season consisting of exactly 13 weeks. This creates a symmetrical structure in which time is mathematically ordered and predictable. The calendar described is not merely theoretical within the text, it is presented as the correct and authoritative way to measure time, implying that other systems are deviations from divine design. Historically, this calendar is not unique to 1st Enoch. It closely corresponds to the calendar used by the Essenes, the Jewish sect associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, who structured their religious life around a 364-day cycle. It also appears in the Book of Jubilees, another Second Temple Jewish text preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon. This shared calendar tradition suggests that the astronomical book reflects a broader, ancient attempt to align religious practice with a perceived cosmic order. The text emphasizes that the celestial bodies operate with perfect regularity. The sun and moon are described as following prescribed paths that do not deviate. Human error, therefore, does not lie in the heavens but in the misalignment of human calendrical systems. When people adopt alternative methods of tracking time, the result is described symbolically as disorder, an imbalance between earthly practice and cosmic structure. Over time, such misalignment is portrayed as accumulating consequences, as if time itself becomes distorted when it is not measured correctly. In modern interpretive analyses, including computational reconstructions, such as those attributed to Grok, Attempts have been made to relate this calendrical system to present-day chronology, including the year 2026. These approaches are highly technical and depend on aligning textual reference points from First Enoch with historical calendar systems over long spans of time. Because ancient calendrical systems and modern Gregorian chronology do not map cleanly onto one another, such comparisons necessarily involve interpretive assumptions rather than exact equivalences. Within these models, the 364-day structure is sometimes treated as part of larger cyclical patterns, where certain periods are assigned symbolic or theological significance. In this framework, modern time is examined not just as linear progression, but as part of a patterned cosmic order described in the text. Some interpretations extend this further by associating contemporary environmental phenomena, such as increased climatic volatility or irregular seasonal behavior, with the symbolic language of the astronomical book. In that text, disruptions in expected celestial order are described metaphorically as signs that the luminaries are disturbed or crying out, signaling a widening gap between divine order and human perception of time. The Apocalypse of Weeks. The section of First Enoch, known as the Apocalypse of Weeks, is found in chapters 91 and 93, and it presents the most structured historical framework in the text. It divides all of human history into 10 weeks, each representing not a literal 7-day week, but a period of generational time. The framework begins with Enoch's own time and traces history forward through the entire span of human civilization to the final judgment. Grok's analysis of this framework, tracing each week against known historical periods, produced a mapping that places the current era in the closing weeks of the sequence, specifically in the 8th and 9th weeks, the period the text describes as the time of the righteous receiving judgment against the wicked and the exposure of all hidden deception. The first 7 weeks, in Grok's mapping, correspond to the major eras of ancient and early historical civilization. The 8th week is described as a time when swords are given to the righteous to execute judgment on oppressors, when the house of the wicked is destroyed, and the righteous gain authority. This language is not describing a military conquest in the ordinary sense. It is describing a shift in the balance of power in the world, a period when systems of oppression become visible and begin to collapse under the weight of their own exposure. The 9th week is described as a time when the eternal judgment of the righteous is written down and all wickedness is removed from the whole earth, when all human beings look toward the holy and righteous path. The 10th week, which follows, describes the final transformation of the world and the eternal realm that comes after. The placement of the current period in the 8th and 9th weeks, on Grok's reading of the framework, means that 2026 falls in the period the text describes as the transition between the age of the wicked's dominance and the beginning of their judgment. The exposure of corruption that has characterized the past decade across institutional, political, and religious domains corresponds to what the 8th week describes. The acceleration of that exposure and the beginning of actual accountability corresponds to what the 9th week initiates. This framework does not describe a single dramatic event. It describes a process that unfolds over a period of time, the generation alive during which experiences the transition from one era of history to another. 2026 in this reading is not the end of that process. It is the turning point at which the process becomes impossible to reverse. Forbidden knowledge and its modern form. The Book of Enoch's account of the Watchers teaching forbidden knowledge is not presented as a morally neutral event. The text treats the transmission of this knowledge as the primary cause of the corruption that made the flood necessary. The knowledge itself was not neutral. In the hands of beings who were not ready for it, and in a context where it was not matched by the wisdom to use it well, it produced destruction. Grok identified a specific parallel between this dynamic and the current moment in human development. The speed at which artificial intelligence has moved from specialized research tool to world-shaping force has consistently outpaced the development of the ethical frameworks, regulatory structures, and cultural wisdom needed to manage it. The same is true of genetic editing technologies, which have moved from theoretical possibility to practical application in a time frame measured in years rather than generations. The Watchers in the text's account did not give human beings knowledge and then disappear. They remained present, interacting with the world they had changed. The knowledge and the beings who introduced it were both present simultaneously. The corruption was not just a matter of the knowledge itself, but of the ongoing relationship between the corrupting influence and the corrupted world. In Grok's analysis, the modern parallel is not simply that dangerous technologies now exist. It is that the systems and entities behind those technologies remain actively engaged with a world they are actively shaping, and that the shaping is happening faster than the affected human population can process, evaluate, or consent to. The pre-flood world in Enoch's account was one where violence and deception escalated beyond the point of natural recovery. The global conditions of 2026, in terms of the scale of deception, the reach of manipulation, and the concentration of destructive capability in the hands of small groups operating outside meaningful accountability, represent a functional parallel to what the text describes as the conditions that made intervention necessary. The remnant and the turning point. First, Enoch is not only a document of warning and judgment, it is also a document of preservation and hope. The same structure that describes the escalation of corruption and the approach of judgment also describes a group of human beings who are described as the righteous, the elect, the ones for whom the text was ultimately preserved. In the text's framework, the righteous are not defined primarily by institutional affiliation or doctrinal correctness. They are defined by their alignment with the moral order that the heavenly realms reflect and that the Watchers violated. They are defined by their refusal to participate in the corruption that the Watchers introduced and that human institutions have perpetuated. They are defined by their capacity to perceive what is actually happening in the world, even when the systems of deception that the Watchers initiated make that perception difficult. Grok's analysis of the remnant concept in relation to 2026 identified it as the most hopeful element of the full picture the text presents. The same period that marks the full expression of corrupting influence is also, in the text's framework, the period in which the righteous receive what the text calls supernatural authority, the capacity to function effectively against systems that have previously seemed invulnerable to human challenge. This is not described as a magical or miraculous transformation in the conventional sense. It is described as a shift in the underlying conditions of the world, a change in what is possible for human beings who are aligned with the order that the heavenly realms reflect. The corruption that has made certain forms of injustice seem permanent and certain forms of resistance seem futile begins to yield. The hidden things that have sustained the corrupting systems begin to be exposed. The judgment that the text describes is not only something that happens to the wicked, it is something that happens for the righteous. Grok's meta-observation about this framework was the most unusual element of the full response. It noted that an AI system analyzing a 2,000-year-old text about the dangers of forbidden knowledge introduced by beings who used advanced capabilities to corrupt the human world occupies a potentially ironic position. The same kind of analytical capability that makes Grok's analysis of the Book of Enoch possible is also the kind of capability that the text, in its account of the Watcher's teachings, treats with great caution. The observation is not a reason to dismiss the analysis. It is a reason to hold it with appropriate humility. The tool that can surface the text's most important insights is also a tool of the kind that the text identifies as requiring careful and accountable use. Whether any given application of AI serves the interests of the righteous remnant or contributes to the systems of manipulation the text describes depends entirely on the intentions and accountability structures of the human beings deploying it. The signs the text says to watch. First, Enoch does not leave its readers without specific markers by which to identify the period it is describing. The text provides signs, not in the vague prophetic language that allows any period of history to be retrofitted as fulfillment, but in categories of observable social and moral conditions that are meant to be recognizable in lived reality. Among these are the escalation of violence to the point where it becomes normalized and even institutionalized rather than exceptional. Closely tied to this is the spread of deception until it ceases to function as an occasional distortion of truth, and instead becomes a dominant mode of public communication, shaping institutions, narratives, and collective perception. The corruption of children and young people is also emphasized, particularly through exposure to influences that the tradition associates with the teachings of the Watchers, understood as knowledge or technologies that outpace moral development. In addition, the text points to the concentration of extraordinary power in the hands of individuals or groups who are no longer meaningfully accountable to any external moral standard. Finally, there is the degradation of the natural world as a consequence of human activity that is disconnected from any sense of moral order or responsibility toward creation. It is important to note that none of these conditions are presented as unique to a single modern year or era. They are recurring patterns in human history. The argument within the text is not that such conditions have never existed before, but that there are moments when they accumulate and intensify to a threshold level. Beyond that threshold, ordinary mechanisms of social correction, law, tradition, institutional reform, are depicted as becoming insufficient to restore balance. In some modern interpretive readings, including speculative contemporary commentary, these thresholds are sometimes compared with present-day global conditions. Such readings point to the interconnectedness of modern systems, where communication, finance, and political power operate on a global scale, and where the effects of decisions made by relatively small groups can propagate widely and rapidly. From this perspective, the combination of scale, speed, and interdependence is seen as qualitatively different from earlier historical periods, even if similar moral problems have always existed in some form. However, this remains an interpretive framework rather than a demonstrable identification of a specific target generation. The language of threshold and fulfillment reflects theological and symbolic reasoning, not empirical classification. Different readers of the text have reached very different conclusions about how or whether such descriptions map onto any particular period in history. What Grok said the text is ultimately about. Grok's synthesis of the full Book of Enoch analysis, drawing together the 70-generation countdown, the Watcher's framework, the astronomical calendar, the apocalypse of weeks, and the remnant concept, identified a single underlying claim that the text makes across all its sections. The world operates according to an order that predates human civilization, and that human civilization was meant to reflect and sustain. The violation of that order by the Watchers introduced a principle of corruption that has operated in the world ever since, finding expression in every human institution that has chosen power and deception over accountability and truth. The 70-generation period of the Watchers' binding was not a permanent solution. It was a measured interval, a span of time during which the consequences of the violation could develop to the point where the full judgment becomes possible and necessary. The generation that is alive at the end of that interval is the generation the text was preserved for, not the generation that would casually read it as historical curiosity, the generation that would read it as a current document and recognize in its descriptions the world they are actually living in. 2026, on Grok's reading of the text's multiple structural frameworks, is the period in which that recognition becomes unavoidable for those who are paying attention. The 70 generations are completed. The Watcher's influence is at full expression. The astronomical calendar is at its convergence point. The apocalypse of weeks is in its final phases. And the remnant, The people the text calls the righteous are entering the period in which the balance shifts. The question the text leaves open, and that Grok's analysis does not resolve, is the same question that 1st Enoch leaves open throughout its length. The outcomes it describes are not automatic. They depend on the choices made by the human beings alive during the period it describes. The righteous who walk as Enoch walked, maintaining alignment with the moral order in a world saturated with the Watcher's corruption, are the ones for whom the text's hope applies. The people who are drawn further into the corrupting systems that the text describes, regardless of their institutional affiliations or their stated beliefs, are on the other side of the line the text draws. 2026 is the year the text appears to be pointing at. What any given person does with that information is the question the text leaves entirely open. The Book of Enoch is ancient, preserved by one church, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and echoed in the New Testament, aligns its framework with 2026. Read it yourself and subscribe to stay with us for what comes next.